So this month, my theme is perseverance. Now, perseverance isn't really a word I use a lot, and so I actually wanted to look it up to make sure I really understood what it meant. And if you look it up and look back to the Latin, it gets to per, which is thoroughly, and severus, which is severe, which that didn't really help. It just meant it's a really strong word. So I kind of went to root words that go similar with it, like to sustain, which means literally to hold from below, or persist, which means to thoroughly to stand. So if you kind of take all of those together, perseverance is really this concept, in this case, from coming from below and really standing up and holding on tight. And the reason this is important to me, or the reason you just saw that video, is because to me the perseverance and the culture or population in this country that we come in contact with the most, that has the biggest record of perseverance, in my opinion, is African Americans. Now maybe I'm unique because I grew up outside of Chicago. And so in the 60s, when I was growing up, there was a lot of rioting going on in the African American neighborhoods in Chicago, and I lived far out. We were more rural Illinois at the time, and I lived in a completely white bubble. And so it was kind of this white privilege that we could just turn our backs on it and not have to pay attention to it because it never really involved us on a day-to-day basis. It was just on the nightly news. So it was a little bit of white privilege when I was really young. And then in seminary, I took part in, it was a testing of a protocol called Beloved Conversation, which is now actually out in congregations as a teaching program on racial issues. In fact, the Appleton congregation is doing it right now. It's a multi-week thing. I was in the pilot, and they set it up as seminarians, and they did half of it deliberately people of color and half of it white folks like me. And so the whole purpose was for us to think about our ancestry and how is it that we came to be where we are in society, and how is my story different than people of color that came to this country. And I found it very, very profound, and it made me think back to my youth, because at the time that white privilege kept me from having to think about it. I was only 7 years old in 1968 as well, but then even into the 70s as a teenager it was continuing to happen. Made me think about it again. And at the time of these conversations, this is a few years ago, I know there was still a lot of gun violence in certain neighborhoods in Chicago, and we all hear the news that they seem to be murder capital of the world, or they trade off with other cities in the United States. And there was a story at the time about children being shot, children walking home from school, and gangs were fighting, and a stray bullet hit a little girl, or a 3-year-old boy was killed because a bullet went through the window in his bedroom when he was, sleeping, and that obviously I found very disturbing, and I brought that up in one of the discussion groups, and I'm like, it drives me crazy. I just want to do something about it, and I'm kind of like, why do we put up with this kind of stuff? Why don't we send in the National Guard or the police or something to stand on every street corner and keep peace? And in my small group, there was a fellow seminarian, an African-American woman from New York City, and she looked at me like I had 4 heads. And she said, that is pretty much the best white supremacist example I could think of. That it's that white guy sending in the troops that are almost always white, that usually abuse their power. And so she said, Jim, you got to think about your history. If you go back in time, those folks aren't trusted in the community, and so that's not going to help. It's probably going to just make it worse. And I said, yeah, but we can't just sit here and do nothing. So what is it? What is it that helps bring the peace, helps these folks persevere? And she said, well, for 400 years since the dawning of slavery, it's been the grandmothers. And now it's the grandmothers that are out on the porches in a corner where there's been a lot of drug trafficking. And everybody knows who those grandmothers are. And they're the people that have the respect still in the community. And it's the grandmothers that are working to keep peace and holding this family and this culture together. Because as you heard in some of the statistics here, a lot of the fathers have been incarcerated, and the mothers are probably working 3 jobs to kind of keep everything together. And it's the grandmothers that are helping the culture persevere. So it was that in mind that I kind of crafted this sermon today. So I wanted to focus and switch gears a little bit here, so that's my own experience, but talk about social justice and what that means, and particularly, well, I'll start with the tenets of social justice. Over in Stevens Point, one of the other congregations I serve, we're working on our vision and mission statement, and they want to clearly talk about social justice right in their mission statement. And there's a woman there who's been doing social organizing, social justice organizing for years, and she said, you know, it kind of comes down to 4 tenets, and I had never really thought of it laid out this way, but maybe it's pretty obvious to everybody. So she said there's education, because first you need to educate yourself on what's going on so that you feel like you know how to get involved, and then educate others. Then there's direct service, where you're directly trying to help someone involved. There's advocacy, where it's service, but it's of a different kind. This is where you're probably taking your privilege and you're advocating for others who can't advocate for themselves in the same way on their behalf. And then ultimately the goal is systemic change, so that if you can help to change the whole system to have the injustices stop or correct themselves is ultimately the goal. So that's a framework I kind of want you to think about as I walk into the other parts of this. So, to the Equal Justice Initiative, that was, I think, a fundraising video for the Equal Justice Initiative, and I had never heard much about it, but I want to give you an explanation of that. It was founded by Bryan Stevenson, and Bryan Stevenson is pretty well known. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, and he's an African-American man, probably in his 30s, I don't know exactly, but very articulate, grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, went to law school, and came back, and his mission in life is to help incarcerated people, mostly African-American men, who've been wrongly imprisoned, to help set them free. And so that's what the Equal Justice Initiative primarily is about. And he wrote a book called Just Mercy, which actually my son had heard about it because on the UW-Madison campus it was the common read, or it might have been in all of Madison a few years back. And so when I was talking about it, he already knew about it. There's actually a museum that talks about the true story of African-American culture, particularly in Alabama, that is opening up on April 26th, and that's what some of this fundraising was for, and he's behind getting that open to tell the real story, and so that's part of that education part. Well, I had the good fortune in Unitarian Universalism, we have a General Assembly every summer, and we all come from all over North America and support each other, and that's our governing body, if there is one, because we're congregations unto themselves, but that's where we all talk and decide on what we want to focus on. Well, Bryan Stevenson was the keynote speaker in New Orleans this year, and so I got to hear him, and he was a phenomenal speaker. And I could talk forever about him, but there's 4 things that he was talking about with social justice that are essential to make a difference. And they're these. The first was getting proximate, and it's a word that I'd never really thought about using in that way. But he said you need to get proximate to the poor, the excluded, the neglected, and the abused, because you can't be effective in social justice from a distance from Jim Coakley's white bubble in rural Illinois. You need to actually really understand and be empathetic from firsthand experience. So get proximate was his first. The second was changing the narratives that underlie racism and other inequalities. And I think this video and the museum that he's opening up is trying to change the narrative that was put forth in this country. He referred to it in the video that a narrative white supremacy was created to make slavery feel okay. So you can only do that if you thought that the folks that were being enslaved were lesser people than you are, or maybe not even people. And we all know that in the Constitution, they were 3/5 of a person. So it started from our founding. So the second was change the narrative. The third was to stay hopeful about creating justice. And he shared a lot of stories about African-American young men who had just given up, that had been imprisoned, that he was their lawyer and helped set them free. And so it just wonderfully hopeful stories. And he said, I mean, there was one story where he had to go into this prison, and he got out of his car in the parking lot, and there's this ginormous pickup truck with Confederate flags on it and license plates, and right next to where he was parked. And it turns out it was the guard who had to let him into the prison. It was his pickup truck. So he goes into this whole story about that was quite touching. So he said, don't give up hope, because you never know. I should finish that story. The guard was pretty nasty to him, an African-American man trying to free people. And over time, the guard turned out to be a really good friend of his, because it turned out that the guard grew up in a miserable life and was just abused. And so, of course, he felt comfortable then abusing other people. And so there was, he goes, you'd be surprised what really can be out there. And the fourth is be willing to do uncomfortable things. And his quote was, we will not change the world if we're not willing to do uncomfortable things. So what I want to talk today about is an opportunity for direct service that gets you proximate, it gets you uncomfortable, you can't really turn away, you can't fix it with white supremacy. Essentially, you're going to be a grandmother. And that is Prison Ministry Network. Now, the Prison Ministry Network is, this is a quote from the website, powered by the Church of the Larger Fellowship. I've got a lot of explanations I got to do today, so just bear with me. So the Church of the Larger Fellowship, let's start there. The Church of the Larger Fellowship is the largest Unitarian Universalist congregation, and it's completely virtual. So it started out about the same time as the fellowship movement, which this congregation calls itself a fellowship. It's a legacy of that fellowship movement. The fellowship movement was trying to put congregations in towns, smaller towns, that probably had people that would be open to Unitarian Universalism, but probably couldn't afford a minister right away. So it's sort of a missionary thing. And in northeast Wisconsin, there's a bunch of them, and the one in Appleton started out that way. Well, at the same time, for even smaller towns and smaller folks, people that are located in even smaller towns, they came up with the Church of the Larger Fellowship that you could be a member of, and you'd get a newsletter. And it was very much the old-fashioned, you get a newsletter every month and that kind of thing. Well, with the internet, it has evolved tremendously. So now it's a congregation that it has 3,500 members. They do worship services twice a week. They have a senior minister. They've got a staff. They've got all this programming. It's pretty incredible. And they started noticing a few years back that they had like 75 members that were incarcerated. And it started growing and growing, and now it's 750 of their 3,500 members are incarcerated. Now, I don't know if they came because it was an opportunity to be part of a spiritual organization within the walls of the prison, or if because they started this prison ministry network, more of them came. It doesn't really matter. But today, about 20% of the membership of the Church of the Larger Fellowship is incarcerated. So they launched and have really beefed up this prison ministry network. It has staffing, and if you want to go find out more about it, and I would encourage you to do so, it's on worthynow.org. So worthynow, WORTHYNOW, but all one word, .org. worthynow.org. And the quote at the head of the website is, Worthy Now invites people on both sides of a prison walls into beloved community. We declare that all persons are worthy of love, respect, and support. Not at some future time when we are better people, but as we are right now. I thought it was fantastic. So they have a variety of programs, and they fit into what I was talking about before with social justice and the phases of social justice. So they have education, they have classes and events where you can learn about mass incarceration and what's going on. A lot of it's virtual, but sometimes they sponsor things in the larger communities. The second is direct service, and they have two types of direct service. One is a pen pal program, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. You become a pen pal, just like it says, with somebody who's incarcerated. And then there's circles of support, which is you're becoming part of a community of people dedicated to working with incarcerated populations. And then the fourth is being an advocate. And it's basically their ambassador program. And this one is you can join the Church of the Larger Fellowship prison ministry team and visiting and advocating for our members in prison. So very physical, it's no longer virtual anymore in many cases. So the reason I brought this up is because, first of all, I thought it was a great example of perseverance with the African American culture, but because a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, Reverend Gail Stratton, who lives in Mississippi, is a part of this prison ministry network. And she was sitting next to me the night we were listening to Brian Stevenson speak. And she said, Jim, I have to tell you about this program, because if there was ever a way of getting proximate with someone, it's through this pen pal program. And so she told me about her program. And she said, in the beginning it seemed a little daunting. I mean, the first thing you have to realize, especially those of you that are of a younger generation in the room, it's going to take you from the 21st century back to the 19th century, because you actually write a letter on a piece of paper with a pen. And because of security concerns and making sure that it's anonymous, or as anonymous anonymity as you can, whatever, I said that wrong, you only use your first name. Nobody will ever know each other's addresses. So you write the letter, you mail it to the Church of the Larger Fellowship's office in Minneapolis, and they get it over to the prison, and then vice versa when it comes back. So that's the other thing. You have to write it manually, but it's going to take at least a month to get the communication to go back and forth. So once again, it's very much like the 19th century. So she said that was one thing that you have to get used to in this world of instant communication. But she very much valued the fact that they had thought this through. They spend a lot of time, even if you apply, in making sure that who you are matches up with somebody inside the walls. It's very deliberate. And then she said there's also some things in place in case something's not working out right. So, for example, she has a male inmate. She's female, and she said at one point the language in his letter was beginning to make her feel a little bit uncomfortable. And she said, I didn't want to just quit because of that. So she reached out to the chaplain of the Church of the Larger Fellowship and tied to this program, and kind of explained what she was feeling. And she said that to just confront it, put it in the next letter, that like these are the kinds of things you're saying that's making me uncomfortable. If you're going to continue to do that, I no longer want to have this relationship. And she said that's all it took. He apologized in the next letter, and the language changed, and it never went there again. She also said, now she's before she became a minister, she was a biology professor at a university, and he is very interested in learning. And got very interested in biology, so she took one of her textbooks that was an older version, and she sent it to him, and I think said in a letter that it was coming, but he never got it for months, because someone had to go through the biology book and pull out any naked pictures of body, any anatomy, because they can't have anything that looks pornographic. So lots of things, you just have to be patient with this, right? And so then she just said, so please tell us, she wants to recommend that everybody sign up, but she said you need to understand there's a lot of safeguards, but there's a lot of frustrations with this program. But she said it was all worth it, and she told me this story. She said she hadn't heard from her pen pal for a couple of months, and she was kind of concerned that something had happened. And finally she got a letter, and in the letter he said, I'm going to cry. He said in the beginning, he goes, my life is a miracle, because I just found out that my entire family died in a house fire. Aww. And he didn't find out about it until like a month later, because he was incarcerated. And of course, as you might imagine, it sent him into a deep depression, and then he was hospitalized and didn't communicate for a while. But he had worked his way through it with some therapy and some help, and was back where the same prison that he was in, and was able to write to her and said that he valued their relationship so much, because now he had no family or immediate family, and just to know that there was somebody out there that knew who he was, knew his thoughts, cared about him, just meant a lot to him. Well, of course, this sent her into a depression. And she said, you know, Jim, for a month I was like wading through mud. It just really, to try to understand what it must be like for him to have that kind of information and to have to deal with that without being able to be there. And once again, I said, Gail, you're not helping me sell this program. You know, if all you're going to do is have your heart broken. And she reminded me of the words of Parker Palmer. Parker Palmer, he's an author and activist and the founder of the Center for Courage and Renewal. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. And in one of his books, he talks about being heartbroken. And he said that many of us walk around life with our heart like a fist. Like it's clenched really tight because maybe we've been hurt, maybe we're kind of cautious and we don't want to be hurt again. And she said, you know, by going through this and being heartbroken, he says it opens up your heart so that you're more open to empathy, you're more open to being human and fully compassionate in this world. And heartbreak is just part of that process, and it's a necessary part of that. So because of all of that, she has grown to see this pen pal as one of her spiritual practices in helping her to become proximate, to offering direct service to someone in a way that is meaningful, even though they're miles and miles and miles away with circumstances in two different worlds. And she very, very values it. And so she wanted me to make sure that you knew about the program, worthynow.org. You don't have to be a member of the Church of the Larger Fellowship at all to take part in the program. So she wanted to talk about that as the best example that she could come up with that I had heard of perseverance. So I'm going to close with a story or a poem from a grandmother. One of the grandmothers that when you think of the African American culture, Maya Angelou comes to mind as probably this iconic grandmother. And it's her poem, Still I Rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room? Just like moons and like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my backyard. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise.